If the mind is nothing but the brain, does that mean that psychology is nothing but physics in disguise? And what does that mean for beings that don't have brains like ours? Can they have minds as well? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Today, I'm going to explain to you a theory called non-reductivism. To review briefly, we've been in philosophy of mind talking about stuff like brains and minds and neurons and thoughts and feelings and experiences and dendrites and all kinds of fun things. And we've been specifically looking at a theory called psychological physicalism, the idea that in that list, the only things that really exist are physical things. Now, for some of those things, of course, that's fine because they are physical, like brains and neurons. But what about those other things that are not physical, like minds and thoughts and experiences? What are they according to this view? For limitivists, that's just nothing, right? Those non-physical things that we're referencing in that list of stuff don't exist. They're non-existent things, and when you use sentences that involve them, they're just false sentences. For reductivism, however, reductivism will allow those to be true sentences. However, reductivism will claim that all those non-physical things just refer to physical things. They're just identical to physical things or are just shorthand to physical things. So, for example, let's say that I'm thinking about a dinosaur. I have a picture of a dinosaur in my mind. Well, an image of a dinosaur is made up of particles, is physical, can be touched, can be seen by multiple people. A real dinosaur is made up of particles, etc., etc. But the image of a dinosaur in your mind, like think about in your brain, is there a physical image there? Are there particles that go into making that up, or is it just a bunch of neurons? Just a bunch of neurons, right? There is no physical image inside of your brain of a dinosaur. So for reductivists, they'll say, yeah, that's not real. That can't be the case because only physical things exist on psychological physicalism, on this view. However, we can still say you have a thought of a dinosaur because we'll reinterpret that, or they'll say that what you really mean by that is that you have a brain in a physical state that we call thought of a dinosaur. That's all you're referring to. So it's just shorthand for brain state D, let's say, where brain state D is thought of a dinosaur brain state. And if that's what we're looking at, then this is very similar to the view Francis Crick once famously espoused, that the mind is what the brain does. You know, the only thing that the mind doesn't exist on it in and of itself. It's really just another word for the brain. That's all you're really saying. Now, if that's the case, it seems like we have potentially two unsavory conclusions that we might want to avoid. So, for example, the first one, if the mind is nothing but the brain, if it's just identical to the brain, then it seems like a whole lot of disciplines like psychology are just really like poor excuses for neuroscience. And it could even be the case that neuroscience is just a very undetailed physics. So what do I mean by that? Imagine I tell you that, I'll give you a story that, you know, I went through some kind of traumatic stress-inducing situation, and it led me to extreme anxiety. And then I went and sought the help of a counselor, and we talked through things, and it helped a great deal. Now, on that story, notice that I have a whole lot of psychological things that I'm talking about. You know, anxieties and thoughts and states of mind, all those kinds of things. So if the mind is nothing but the brain, what could that mean? You know, if reductivism is true, if psychological talk is just really brain talk, then what would that mean? Well, it means something like this. Photons hit my retinas in a specific way, and it physically forced some signal to go to my brain that physically induced some kind of brain state. You know, not really worrying about the content of what I experienced, just that kind of a photon barrage forces me physically to have a brain state. That brain state forces me to, you know, contract my muscles in such a way that I end up at this specific location, physical location, and it forces my jaw muscles to work in such a way, and my larynx and all. I don't know. I'm saying a lot of sciencey things that I don't really know about, but so it forces me to speak, forces me to cause air to vibrate in a specific way that hits the eardrum of another person and forces them to cause air to vibrate towards me. And when that gets into my eardrum, it physically forces my brain into a different kind of state. Notice in this whole description, I've avoided all talk of psychology. I've avoided all talk of the actual content of what the counselor and I would be talking about, of my feelings for what is happening in this traumatic situation. I've avoided all those things, and I've given you a purely physical description. Now, if reductivism is true, it seems like that's the case. That's what's got to be the case, is that all mind talk is nothing but just shorthand for neuroscience, or, like I said, even possibly for just physics in general. Remember that what we're really talking about today is non-reductivism. So reductivism is really just a foil here for us to be able to explain non-reductivism. And non-reductivism wants to avoid this difficult saying that all the social sciences are really just a poor man's version of neuroscience or even physics. But what's interesting is non-reductivism doesn't want to do away with psychological physicalism. It doesn't want to say that anything exists that is not physical, right? So it's not, when it says non-reductive, it doesn't mean that they're going to believe that there is a mind that is not reducible to the brain. We're really going to be talking more about language being reducible. Are those sciences like psychology reducible to neuroscience? Not is the mind reducible to the brain. They very much believe that there is no, just like the reductivist believes that you don't have an image of a dinosaur, really, like there's just neurons up there. That's going to be the same thing here for non-reductivists. But again, they don't want to throw out stuff like psychology. So how are they going to do this? If it's not the case that there's anything that exists that's non-physical, then it seems like physics exhaustively explains everything, right? It should be the case that physics can describe to you everything that's going to happen as long as you knew where all the atoms were and you knew how to calculate things perfectly and very quickly. Well, in order to show how this is possible, non-reductivists will point out the fact that individual things that go into making up a group, when the group solely consists of just those individual things, as a group can still have properties that the individual things don't have as the individual things. So, for example, let's say that I get a bunch of you guys and I say, hey, let's start up a philosophy club, guys. Yeah, let's get together. But just for the sake of this philosophy club, we're not going to have any t-shirts, we're not going to have any rules, we're not going to meet in any building or any specific buildings, right? We won't have any paraphernalia, nothing aside from the members that are going to go up into making this club. That's all we're going to be, is just the people in the club, because we're eccentric philosophers, let's say. Well, it was, interestingly enough, once we get into that group, we could have some things true about us that even though we're just a collection of individuals, we're making it so that the group is nothing but the individuals. Even so, we can have properties as members of a group that we didn't have as individuals collectively. So, for example, let's say we decide to meet at a coffee shop. I know, shocker, right? Philosophers in a coffee shop. But my favorite is High Tide Coffee in San Clemente, but because they only have outdoor spaces right now, so let's do Moon Goat Coffee in Costa Mesa, which is, love that place too. And they're open late, so that's really cool. And they have a nice indoor setting. So let's say we're meeting at Moon Goat Coffee, and we're the only ones in there except for this one guy in the corner, Grumpy Gary. And Grumpy Gary just wants to sit there and enjoy his coffee and not hear anything, right? He wants a pin drop kind of silence. And, we all are meeting up together, and we decide to go one by one, introduce each other, or introduce ourselves, I guess, and, say where you're from, and, what is your favorite philosopher? And that's a terrible question. Just pretend like I didn't say that. I don't know. Say a few things about yourself. What philosophical tradition do you come from? And each one of us individually, let's say, speaks quietly enough that it's actually inaudible to Grumpy Gary. Grumpy Gary can't hear us over the din of the coffee making, let's say. But then, after we go one by one individually, I say, okay, everybody, let's break up into groups and introduce yourself to your neighbor and tell him three things or her four things, or, do something like that. And when we start to talk collectively, all of a sudden, our voices can become loud enough that we're audible to Gary. And now Gary is upset with us and wants to kick us all out. But who's he going to be mad with? Each one of us individually is speaking very quietly, right? None of us here are shouting. It's just that as a group together, we were making a loud enough noise to upset Gary. So notice that the group in itself can affect other people's in a way that individuals themselves, we're not doing anything wrong as individuals. So it's not like any one of us individually can be at fault here. It's going to have to be the group that's at fault. Or another thing is that we as a group could have goals that are contrary to our goals as an individual. So what is the most important thing for a philosopher to do? Well, of course, it's to publish books that totally demolish any opposing views, right? Of course. And let's say as individuals, that's what our goal is. That's what we really want. That's why we're here in this group. And yet, let's say we decide, you know what? We can all get discovered here. We can all get our names out there if we publish a book corporately that talks about our different debate topics, that gives our different perspectives. And thinking about that, it would behoove you as an individual to get this book published, to get it out there, right? To get it to be a really good book and really juicy and a lot of people to read it. And if that's the case, if your name is out there, then you can actually go ahead and publish those books that you really want to publish that, totally annihilate the views that you're not. I don't like that kind of philosophy, by the way. I mean, I like giving reasons for believing what I believe, and I don't just believe everything is possible, but I also don't like philosophy that's just sort of one-upping each other. That's not real philosophy. But in any case, let's say that's what your goal was. It might be the case that everybody individually has this goal that is to get published in these kinds of books. But in order to accomplish that goal, in order to achieve that goal as individuals, we decide to help out the guys that disagree with us in our group. We sort of, cooperate here. I give you arguments against my own view because I want your view to be very solid. So when people read it, they say, oh, this is a really good debate book, right? So notice my goal as an individual is actually contrary to my goal as a member of the group. And if everybody's like that, our entirety as individuals, our goals are contrary to the goal that we have as members of the group. So it's really weird, right? Like our group membership can entail kind of like contradictory goals here. And finally, we have different persistence conditions from our group. So let's say we do get discovered and we go out into the world, we move into different places, different universities that we get hired at, and our group dissolves. Now, none of us have died, none of us have been destroyed, but our group has kind of died, right? Our group no longer exists. Even though the individual members of the group still exist, the group doesn't exist. Or contrary-wise, and this is, I guess, a little bit more of a far-fetched idea, but let's just say, we get our group and we solidify it and we meet for a lot of times. And then after several years, we get a few new members. And then all of us together go out on the same day and we all die in some horrific accident, except for those new members. So all of the original members are dead, are gone. And yet the group can still survive even without those original members that, remember, made up the entirety of the group. There was nothing to the group except for those individual members. Now the same goes, or at least so says the non-reductivist, for the cells that make me up, right? It might be the case that this sack of cells here that make up me as a person, I should explain, personhood here would be something similar to mind, where it's a non-physical thing, right? There's nothing on me that is a person cell, right? There's no, there's my heart cell, here's my lung cell, here's my person cell, right? All I have are these cells that are physical. Personhood is either a non-physical thing or is just the set of physical things that I have. So let's say it's the set of physical things I have, like the non-reductivist would say. Things could be true of this set of cells that are, as a group, as a person, that are not true of them individually. So just like we as a group could affect Grumpy Gary, piss people off, in the same way, this set of cells could interact with another set of cells, my counselor, and we could interchange in some special ways. And in ways that our cells wouldn't do individually. It's not like if you took all of our cells and mixed them up in one big pot and said, look, they're having a conversation. Well, not quite, right? It would have to be this group and that group interacting as groups and not as individuals. It's also the case that my cells as a group, as a person, have goals that the individuals don't have. So, for example, interestingly, a lot of the cells of your body don't have some self-preservation kind of goal. They have a preservation of the person kind of a goal. Some of your cells are willing to die so that the person as a whole can live. So individually, they don't have the same goals as the person, just like individually, we as philosophers wouldn't have the same goals as we as a group had. And finally, just like we had different persistent conditions for our group of philosophers than we did as philosophers individually, our personhood and our individual cells have different persistence conditions. So just like we moved away and our group dissolved and yet we were still existing, all the individuals that made up the group still exist, but the group doesn't exist. The same thing would happen if you took each one of my cells and maybe kept them alive artificially, but spread them all over the universe. Well, they would still be alive, but I would no longer, as a person, be alive. Or, my cells are constantly dying and being replaced by other cells. Every 7 years, you've gone through every single cell and replace it with a new cell. Except for, I think I've heard the neurons don't do that, and it would be way cooler if they did, and then we could say it's all totally there. But let's just say, at the very least, the electrons that are involved in making up your brain cells, those move around and change all the time. So at least we know those are not totally fit. And you can imagine, it's not theoretically implausible that your brain cell could die off and be replaced by a new brain cell or something like that. So you could continue to exist even if each one of your individual cells no longer existed, so long as you had replacement cells. So it seems like you can't do all the work that you did with psychology and with economics and with other disciplines like that with neuroscience. It's like the one can't be reduced to the other because in one sense we're looking at the group of cells as a whole operating as a group versus looking at them as individual physical things. So that's what the non-reductivist argument is that even though the only thing that exists there is physical stuff, like the neurons that make up your brain, that doesn't mean that talk about the mind is totally reducible to talk about the brain. We're still going to have to use words like, thoughts and experiences, even if those things aren't real things, even if that's just a way to describe that how the brain is working as a whole. That's all that it is. Another benefit to this, or I should say another detriment to reductivism, is that it entails that things that don't have brains, like humans have brains, can't have minds. What do I mean by that? One of the views of reductivism that we saw was called identity theory, right? Which this makes it a lot clearer, and you just trust me on this, that all reductivists have the same problem. So identity theory is that the mind is just identical to the brain. It's just a different word for the brain. Now, if that's the case, let's say I have this thought of a dinosaur in my head, in my mind, and all that means for the reductivist is this brain state right here, brain state D. Well, if that's the case, then any entity that didn't have a brain that was identical to my brain couldn't be in that brain state, so couldn't have a thought of a dinosaur. That's pretty weird to say. We could think of a number of potential things that either could exist or do exist that could have minds but don't have human brains. So, for example, androids like C-3POs and all those kinds of fun robots, they could have thoughts of dinosaurs and yet they would have CPUs instead of brains. Or aliens that are totally different from us, like aliens that are made of crystal structures. They'd have crystal brains, but they wouldn't have, meat brains like ours, or even aliens that are made up of gaseous substances like you see in Star Trek. They just sort of float in and say, Kirk, and it's really weird. Well, those guys would have thoughts of stuff, and they wouldn't have physical brains like ours. They would have, cloud brains. Now, those are obviously sci-fi type of examples, but even stuff like dogs. It seems like a dog could think of, maybe not a dinosaur, but could think of like food that it would like to have that's not right in front of it. And yet thinking of dog food, although it's not something that I enjoy, is something that I do. Seems like my dog can do, and yet my dog has a different brain than I do. If thinking of dog food is a specific brain state that I have, then that would mean that my dog that doesn't have the same brain that I have can't have that brain state, right? Can't even have that type of brain state because it doesn't have the type of brain that I have. Now, importantly, you got to remember that the non-reductivist is not trying to argue that dogs have images of in their minds of dog food. Like they're sitting there and they're considering, wow, yeah, I remember what that looks like. And it's not trying to argue that computers can have a self-awareness, like, whoa, yeah, wouldn't some dog food be great? Not because they don't believe those things exist. They don't believe you have an image of a dinosaur in your mind. They think since that's non-physical, since there's no physical image there in your brain, then it can't exist. So they're not arguing that dogs and robots can have some life of the mind that's private and that we can't see. Instead, remember that the reductivist is using this word mind to refer to the brain. And what the non-reductivist is saying is, the way we're using that word mind, it seems like dogs and androids and funny spacemen, they could all be doing the same thing that we do when we say we have a thought of a dinosaur. So wouldn't the word apply there? And if the word applies to these things, doesn't it mean that the mind can't just be exactly what the human brain is? It must be something about the human brain, but not just the physical thing itself. In other words, the non-reductivist still maintains that the only thing that exists there is the physical brain. Still maintains that these mind words refer to the physical brain, but not exactly. They believe that these words refer to something that the physical brain maybe is doing, or some role that the physical brain is playing in the person's interaction with the world. And the idea is that, things like androids and dogs and aliens could have something inside of them that plays that same role that the brain plays for us, just for them. And it would be a different type of physical entity than the type of physical entity that we have in our skulls. So that's really what the non-reductivist wants to claim. The non-reductivist wants to claim two things. Number one, that talk about the mind can't be just reduced to talk about the brain, even though the only thing that really exists is this physical stuff up here, this brain that I have. And number two, when we use that word mind, we sure are talking about the brain, but we can't be talking about it in such a simplistic one-to-one kind of correspondence where just thought D equals brain state D or something like that. We must be talking about just a role that the brain is playing, a function that it's using. In fact, and we'll talk about functionalism coming up here very soon. This is actually the second time I've done this video. The first time I did it, I was trying to explain too much. I got some helpful comments that told me where I could maybe explain it a little bit better, and I really appreciate that, guys. I can't remember, two guys told me, like what would be helpful, and I thank you for that. But if you have any comments or any questions, please hit me up in the comment section. And I'd love to hear from you guys, and thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Adios.